Hi, everybody. We're going to run through some problems that are going to be similar to the ones that you'll see on your final exam. So the first set of problems, I'm going to give you the mood and figure of a syllogism, and you're going to have to write out in English language statements what the syllogism is. So for example, if I gave you AIO3, I'm not going to worry about the location of the middle term here. So we know that the major term P is in the first premise. A is all PRM. I some SRM. Again, we're not worried about the middle term quite at this point. O is some SR not P, so some SR not P. Now, so that's the mood, and then the figure is 3. So figure 3, the middle term actually needs to be stacked on the left. So this needs to be all MRP. P, remember the major term goes in the first premise. And then this would be all MRS. And that would be a correct answer to an AIO 3 mood and figure. Question. In the next part of the exam, I will give you the opposite. I will give you syllogism. It might contain just letters like this, or it might contain words like all mammals are pigs. Not a true statement, but could be in there. Okay, so, and then what you'll have to do is you'll have to identify from a list what this is. So we know that this is the first statement is an A form, the second statement is an I form, and the conclusion is O. And then this is the same one we did earlier, so we know that it's an AIO3 because the middle term is stacked in the subject position in both premises. So it'll be the opposite of the first section. So I'll give you the written out syllogism, and you will have to just identify mood and figure. The next part of the exam, I will give you, in the instructions of the exam, I will give you 2 things. One will be a Venn diagram with multiple areas identified with numbers. The other thing will be I'll give you the 5 rules for the evaluation of validity of syllogisms. And then you'll have a question. So for example here, I'll give you a syllogism like this. And I'll say, and then there'll be multiple options at the end, and it'll say something like, this syllogism is valid, which means that it doesn't break any of the rules, or they'll be listed off options of rules that are broken. So for example, first rule, middle term must be distributed. So the middle term is distributed here, so it passes that. As you go through the rules, you know, if there's a particular proposition, there can only be one, and those syllogisms must have a particular conclusion. It passes that. The rule that it fails here, or some of them fail multiple rules, but there'll only be one option of failure. So if it fails multiple rules, you'll have to identify which one it fails, and I won't have included both because you can answer both. I'll only include one of the failures. So the failure here is that if you have a negative conclusion, you have to have one negative premise. And if you have one negative premise, then you must have a negative conclusion. It goes the opposite way too. So it fails that rule. So one of the options might be, it has a negative conclusion and it doesn't have a negative premise. And you would select that one because that is the rule that's broken. All right. The next section is going to be on enthymemes. We will not be doing sorites. And remember, an enthymeme is an argument that is missing either a premise or a conclusion. So here's an example. We should go to the movies because it's raining outside. So what you'll have to do is supply the missing premise or conclusion. So in this case, that's a missing premise. The conclusion is that we should go to the movies. So the missing premise is, if it's raining outside, we should go to the movies. Then it is raining outside. Thus, we should go to the movies. Now, in this case, you won't have to write out the entire syllogism, but it might help you as you're working these problems. With these ones, you're actually not going to choose from a list. You are going to have to write out the premise or the conclusion that is missing. So remember, in an enthymeme, it could be a premise that's missing or a conclusion. In the next part of the exam, and you can find this type of problem in the practice test that I sent out to all of you. But in this part of the exam, like I said, in the instructions, I'll give you a diagram that looks exactly like this with the areas labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then I will give you a syllogism. It might be written in complete English language statements, or it might be just like all MRP, no SRM, thus. So it might be written that way. And what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to shade it and appropriately, shade the premises appropriately. Remember, you do not shade the conclusion. And then you will have to choose from a selection of choices. So it's a multiple choice question, what the proper shading is. So if, for example, and remember the middle term is always the middle circle. So it's important that you know that this is the S circle, this is the P circle on the right, and the middle term is the middle circle. So let's say your first premise is all P are M. So P is this circle, M is this circle. So if all P are M, then you would shade 6 and 7. Because when you shade, you create emptiness, or you create nothingness, and then all the P's that are M's would still exist in the 3 and 4 area. So one of the answer choices would say areas 6 and 7 shaded. Now some might, some of the syllogisms will have all universal statements, and some will have a mixture of universal and particular. So remember, when there's a particular statement, you have to put an X in the appropriate area or on the line, depending on what's shaded and what isn't. And so the answer choices will say things like 6 and 7, area 6, let's say that after you shaded it, 6 and 7 were shaded and there was an X in 2. Which actually is impossible. Let's say there was an X on the line between 2 and 3. Then one of the answer choices would be areas 6 and 7 are shaded, and an X is on the line between areas 2 and 3. And you would select that answer because when you appropriately fill in your Venn diagram, that would be the correct answer. The next part of the exam is probably going to be the hardest part. And I think there's only like 3 of these, maybe 2. But I'm going to give you an everyday language argument. You're going to have to change it to categorical form and then determine. So for example, with this one, you'll have to determine what the conclusion is. So a few snakes have fangs. That would be some snakes are things that have fangs. So there are snakes that are not friendly. So that so is a conclusion indicator. So some snakes are not things that are friendly. And we know that's the conclusion, so we're missing the second premise. Whatever has fangs is unfriendly. All things that have fangs are things that are unfriendly. Shrink this a little bit to get it on one line. So if I give you this and I say, what is the conclusion in standard form? You would say, some snakes are not things that are friendly, or something like that. And remember, if you just say some snakes are not friendly, that is not standard form, because you need to have a subject or a predicate class, a noun, a group of nouns. Now, if you wrote some snakes are not friendly, I would still give you partial credit because you're partially right, but you really need things that are not friendly or are not animals that are not friendly. It doesn't matter what you say. You could say are not creatures. As long as you have something in there that is a group of nouns, a predicate class, then it doesn't matter when I grade it because I have to give you credit because it is correct logically. So that's probably going to be the hardest area because not only you're going to have to translate the sentences into categorical form, you're going to have to put them in the proper place as well. And I just realized something else. This is not in standard form, the syllogism. Because the predicate, the major term, is things that are not friendly. And the related major term is right here. So really this would need to be in the second place. And notice that also these don't match because when it says there are snakes that are not friendly, all things so not friendly and unfriendly, really we need to change this. So instead of saying unfriendly, all things that have fangs are things that are not friendly. Some snakes are things that are not friendly. And then this statement needs to go as the first premise. Our second statement becomes the minor premise. And that is incorrect in the correct form now. So again, make sure that your premise that has the major term is the first premise, and the premise that has the minor term, snakes, is in the second area. Because I might ask you to identify the major premise, the minor premise, or the conclusion. So this one is not just about identifying conclusions. The next part will be a few true-false questions could be based on anything, probably more based around the most fundamental concepts that we've been learning. So they're not going to be like really esoteric or whatever. You should know these things off the top of your head if you've been engaging with the content. So for example, inductive arguments prove their conclusions, true or false? False. Inductive arguments support their conclusions. Deductive arguments attempt to prove their conclusions. And that's just a fundamental aspect of logic. And hopefully you know that. Not trying to diminish you if you don't know that. But if you came out of this class saying that inductive arguments prove their conclusions, then I have failed you miserably as a teacher, or you have failed yourself as a student, or we've failed together. And it would make me very unhappy if you were walking around Boston College saying that. So you know this. Inductive arguments support their conclusions. The next part of the exam will be on informal fallacies. There will be 5 questions. Most of you probably will be fine on this section. We had an almost entire test on these, and people tended to do pretty well on this section. So, be sure that you're familiar with your fallacies, and you should do fine on that section. And the final 3 sections, I will give you a long argument, and they all have 3 premises and a conclusion, and you'll have to identify the conclusion. And this reaches back to the initial part of the course. Next will be inductive-deductive distinction. So I will give you an argument, and you'll have to identify whether or not it's inductive or deductive. And finally, there will be a few questions over the article that we read since the last exam. And I'm going to make this generic and not mention that article. It might be a series of articles for future classes. So make sure that you take a look at the study guide, because I list the articles that you need to be ready for in the study guide. And I make reference to them in the email that I sent all of you. All right, so what have we done here? Well, we provided examples of questions that you're going to face on the final exam. I've demonstrated how to appropriately answer those questions. And now continue your studies. I wish you well. Just think about how much you're learning. If you get frustrated, take a break. But just keep studying, keep thinking, and it's been great working with you over this semester.